say hello to all of you. And as you may have just heard, we're going to record this evening's event. Thank you for joining us at today's FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talk is part of the Love Your Library event series hosted by FIT Library. We invite authors from our community to speak about their work, whether photography or fashion illustration, fiction, writing, or fine art. Our talks celebrate creativity. Today, our FIT author is Brenda Cowan, who will talk about her book, Museum Objects, Health and Healing, the Relationship Between Exhibitions and Wellness. Brenda is in our Exhibition and Experience Design program, which is part of the FIT School of Graduate Studies. A former chairwoman of the program, her areas of expertise include, among a myriad of others, exhibition concept and narrative development, research and evaluation, and audience and object studies. Brenda has been teaching at FIT since 2007. Museum Objects, Health and Healing provides an innovative and interdisciplinary study of the relationship between objects, health, and healing, shedding light on the primacy of the human need for relationships with objects. The book explores what kind of implications these relationships may have on the exhibition experience. As one of your biggest fans, I'm so delighted you've joined us today. Take it away, Brenda.
Wow. Thank you so much. And I've got to say, for a bit of a museum nerd, the idea of having a fan is definitely kind of cool and interesting. So thank you so much for that, Greta. I'm going to get my screen share business going on so that we can kickstart. All right. And Greta, can you tell me, is this looking okay from your?
Yep, it looks great. Got it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I got to tell you, it is so unbelievably self-indulgent to be able to talk about my work because it's such an enormous part of my life. So I really appreciate you being here. Throughout, what we're going to do is capture any questions that you might have or particular comments that you want us to be sure to follow up on. If you would put those into the chat column, and I know that Greta is going to be keeping tabs on those, and hopefully we should have plenty of time towards the end to be able to address some of your questions. To get kick-started, for anybody who might not know me, I am an educator. I'm also a museum professional, and like so many of you, if not all of you present right now, been doing a lot of very interesting kinds of teaching these days. I'm also a scholar and an author, and the work that I'm going to be presenting to you right now really is very much so a blend of all of these different aspects of myself, and mostly sort of around the nexus point of my particular research work. So obviously, as per the title of the book, Museum Objects, Health and Healing is very much so at the very core of the work that I explore and the work that of course is featured in the book. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking specifically about the relationship between mental health and the human object relationship, which I'm going to explain. Thereafter, how it is that museum exhibitions foster well-being and healing, because there's a progression. My work really began when, as a teacher for many, many years in the classroom, teaching object studies, which is an enormous part of museum and exhibition studies, I found that I was never really fully satisfied. Objects, as I'm sure you all know, objects are very meaningful in people's lives. We have a lot of different relationships with them. We do a lot of different things with objects. We construct meaning with and around and related to objects. And I unpack a lot of this work through my work within the program. And I found, though, that I was never really fully satisfied, because even though I could talk about how objects have different evocative characteristics, how they can be sources of communication, they can have voices within an exhibition, I could never really dive deeply enough into really understanding and explaining, but why? And specifically, why is it that objects are important? Number one, like why, beyond how we use them? Why are they important? And what purpose do they serve? And that's the trick. Once you start really asking about pretty much so anything, what purpose does it serve? All of a sudden you discover there are a lot of things that are unknown. And that was my relationship with teaching object studies in exhibitions, was that there was a lot that was just unknown about why on earth do people have objects in their lives and in these very particular ways, which therefore has a lot of gaps, or had for me a lot of gaps, about what it is that the value of museums truly is. So I have a theory, and I have a theory about how it is that objects are important, about very much so the purpose that they serve in people's lives, and therefore how it is that museums have a very, very unique and very powerful role to play in our lives. And the theory goes like this. So I'm going to ask you to insert yourself within the next handful of slides. And we're going to begin unpacking my theory with a question, which is, if any of you here has a meaningful object that you keep near, ask yourself this question. So it's any kind of object at all that just feels comfortable if you know where it is. And it might be something like a special piece of jewelry that you wear every day, no matter what, or a keepsake on a shelf. Maybe it is something that's in a box in the closet, but it's critical that you know that it's there and it's nearby. If you have any of those kinds of experiences with objects, you're experiencing a dynamic action that I call associating. And it literally is a dynamic where you need to have a meaningful object physically close by. Do you have two or more objects that are meaningful when they're kept together? And this is a situation, let's say, where you have a collection of objects that are meaningful, and they're especially meaningful because they're all together in their collection. Or it could be a memorial or a little shrine. People make a lot of little shrines in their homes, intentionally and otherwise. It could be a set of jewelry where it would just be wrong somehow not to wear the complete set. This dynamic relationship is what I call composing. And it is very simply a dynamic action where we will always keep multiple, two or more objects together. Have you ever given or received a meaningful object? And I hope so. It could be a birthday gift that you were so excited to give to somebody because you were so hopeful that they would receive it. And you were so hopeful that they were going to receive it and be very happy about it or pleased with it. It could be a family heirloom that you inherited, or that you are gifting down to your child or another family member. And it could be something like a wedding ring, right? Kind of the ultimate icon of giving and receiving. Giving and receiving is a critical human object relationship within people's lives. And it is specifically about having a gift that is given and received with its intent held intact. Have you ever made anything? That is another critical intrinsic human object relationship where the making of the object is meaningful. This could be an art, it could be a craft, it could be some kind of practice that is just an ongoing part of your life of creating something. The critical thing with this question is, have you ever made something and had flow experience? You know, that experience where time just kind of slips away. If you have, and chances are you have, being that we have a predominantly FIT crowd here, you've experienced a very, very meaningful human object relationship, dynamic relationship that I call making. Have you ever permanently removed a meaningful object from your life? And permanently, that's the key word here. This could be donating things, it's spring cleaning, you are giving things to charity, or you had a bad relationship, the relationship is over, and you're going to dump that person's stuff out the window. Okay, it's over. Okay, perhaps it's a meaningful object belonging to somebody who was very meaningful to you, somebody who you loved, and it was time to move that object along as a part of processing that loss. That's a dynamic action called releasing, unburdening. And it literally is this, it is a miraculous dynamic to learn about, where the removal of the object from your life gives you a feeling of relief, of closure, of lightness. Have you ever contributed something to a larger collection of meaningful objects? And this dynamic action specifically is one where you contribute something to a larger, oftentimes a larger collection of things, and you feel like you have become part of something larger than just yourself. You've contributed to a charity, and in many cases that I'm going to be sharing with you, maybe you have shared an object with a museum. This is a marvelous human dynamic relationship that I call synergizing. And it literally is this thing that happens when you contribute an object to a larger collection of very meaningful objects. Have you ever touched an object, consciously, unconsciously, and felt calm as a result of that? And this is something that we see play out all the time. And it could be touching the sweater of someone who you loved and lost. It could be you're talking about your spouse and you kind of catch yourself, kind of twiddling with your wedding ring. Or, God forbid, maybe somebody has been able to sneak a touch of a museum object. What is that impulse, right? It's the dynamic action of touching. And you're going to hear a little bit more about this, but it triggers a state in the brain called hypnoglyph, which is the act of touching. Even if you're touching something with your nose, the skin receptor engaging with an object triggers a calming effect in the emotional region of your brain. It's a fascinating dynamic action. And altogether, these 7 perhaps familiar human dynamic actions. If you're familiar with those, you actually really do know the heart of this whole theory. The object experiences that I was explaining are actually each and every one a part of a therapeutic process, only with the absence of a therapist. It is a self-therapy that can be very clearly unpacked and identified within each of those 7 specific object dynamics. I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. But it is the theory of psychotherapeutic object dynamics. The thing to know is that the theory identifies how it is that objects, even just the most ordinary of objects, they're actually primary and essential to human health and well-being. And if you really, really dig down to the roots of this, if human beings did not have objects around them, we would literally be in a state of psychosis. Objects literally ground us to the earth. They are instrumental in cognition, perception. So you can really bring this down to a very rudimentary level, but straight on up to the wedding ring or the sweater or the museum objects. Each of these objects presents a very, very fundamental primary element of our well-being and our health. The best way, I think, to think about what the theory is about is that just like we need vitamins and minerals every single day in order to stay healthy and to be well, and I think especially like when we're sick, we need to heal, maybe we need certain nutrients more than others even. In the exact same way, human beings require these different kinds of object engagements and relationships in order to stay psychologically well. It is the very same sort of metabolic experience. So the easiest way to think about the mechanics of the theory, if you look at the bubble of object actions, those are those 7 things. that we just went through, the touching, synergizing, associating, and so forth. Specific things that I've been able to identify that people do over and over and over again, all over the world. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your background is. It doesn't matter what your age is. Those 7 object dynamics are absolutely universal. And by the way, there's a couple more. And once COVID is over enough, I'll be able to share some more dynamic actions with you. But those 7 are the object actions that occur in our everyday life. When those objects have associations, again, let's stick with a wedding ring because it's kind of easy. I wear my wedding ring every single day. Okay. It is an act of associating. I just need to know what's around. It feels weird if I'm not wearing it, right? I associate the wedding ring with my husband, with a beautiful, meaningful relationship in my life, in a special time, in a special place, okay? So object associations are those subjective elements to an object relationship, and they could be absolutely anything. We have the third piece. And so those 2 things happen simultaneously. I'm wearing the ring right now, and it has all of those associations. It's happening, right? The object also has characteristics. And you'll hear about object characteristics. There's a brilliant arena of scholarship called phenomenology that is a part of object studies that looks at the phenomena of objects and object meanings, and specifically that objects are very evocative. You might hear somebody talk about this object, I keep it because it bore witness, well, to my wedding day, let's say. Objects are referred to as life partners, companions. Objects are referred to as numinous, spiritual. They spur a kind of transcendent feeling, even a transpersonal feeling in people. All of those different kinds of ways of thinking about and experiencing an object, those evocative characteristics are very, very commonplace. And it is those object characteristics, okay, combined with the object associations and the object action, all of which is playing out just by me wearing a ring, okay? This is a metabolic relationship that specifically can be linked to well-being, just everyday, ordinary well-being. So this catalytic relationship, woo, look at that. That's it. That's as exciting as the presentation is going to get. All of these things are catalytic and they're therapeutic in form, resulting specifically in well-being and healing outcomes. So every time you wear that ring or you throw stuff out the window because you need to, or you give or you receive a gift, you are actually undergoing a therapeutic process. And that has specific attributable health, well-being, and healing outcomes. They're the 7 that we spoke about, and the theory gets quite complex beyond this because each of those dynamics, each of these different dynamic actions, you can have multiple ones happening at the same time as well. So there's a lot to unpack, even in something as simple as wearing a ring. Therapeutic outcomes, just so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Some of the most prevalent therapeutic outcomes, and there's a long list affiliated with each of those 7 different object actions. There's a long list of evidence-based therapeutic outcomes that occur through the act of touching or making or associating and so on. But some of the most prevalent ones that we come across are endurance, resilience, self and identity, feelings of belonging, being a part of a community, personal power, being a part of family, of society, trauma healing, and hope. Hope is a big, big, big one. We need to have, this is like the super short list of elements that we need to have as a part of human development, but also as a part of well-being, and definitely when we are going through a healing process, dealing with grief, dealing with loss, we need to have these items in order to be balanced and in order to heal and to stay well. So these things can be directly attributed to that dynamic relationship that's happening between us and objects in our lives. The theory is interdisciplinary, and it's a framework for understanding the inherent role of objects in human life. So if you look at the psychotherapeutic object dynamics, and you start to look at objects through what are the associations, what are the evocative characteristics, and what's the action that's happening with that object. If you start looking at an object in your life or something that's meaningful even to somebody else, and if you look at it through the lens of those three elements, that framework, you will suddenly, a whole world will open up, and you will suddenly be able to realize, wow, that's why I feel so good, right? Or, wow, I can't believe that's how I got through that time in my life. It's really quite a marvel when you get the hang of it. So these things, these object relationships, happen every day in our everyday lives, and they also occur in museums. And that was the piece that I was really working so hard to get to. How does this make museums make sense? And just point of entry, museums, in my mind anyway, and I've worked in them for about 30 years, they don't make a whole lot of sense. Museums are not very practical places. They are expensive. They are very difficult to maintain. They are complex organisms and complex organizations. And if you think about it, they don't really kind of make a whole lot of sense. Why would we spend, really for centuries, the time, the money, the efforts, the energy to collect, to preserve, to educate, to do all of the things that museums do, to engage with other human beings? Why would we do this? And when you look at objects in this framework, all of a sudden you see museums as places of health and healing. And you've got a logic that I was desperate for forever, and am starting to really get a handle on. Museums are not only not, purposeless, they are, I believe, essential. And I don't think we're going to lose them, COVID or otherwise. Museum experiences, especially museums that have a high level of participation with audiences, which I'm going to show you some examples of, enable us to really see how powerful these places are in people's lives. And furthermore, how it is that objects enable us to connect to each other, but also to humanity as a whole. And I'm going to kind of land the presentation on this note of broader humanity, because again, it's such an incredible path, this work. So I co-authored this book with two therapists who were my research associates, and who were the two individuals as practitioners of psychotherapy, where they used objects in different ways as a part of their therapies. They were able to help me really articulate and pinpoint and really validate the therapeutic outcomes as a part of the theory. And they participated in several of the data collection sessions as a part of the case study work. But the whole journey for me really began it was in 2015. And I found myself down in North Carolina doing some field research at an adolescent wilderness therapy facility. And these are young people who were dealing with a whole lot of trauma, and they were dealing with loss, and they were dealing with grief. And this was an inpatient, a super duper inpatient therapeutic facility, because they were basically living in the mountains with nothing for months. And it was quite an experience. And I went there and spent a lot of time actually in the woods, in the mountains, with a troupe of young teenage girls who were going through therapies. And I also conducted a large number of interviews with the therapists, with the field staff, and the clinical director, and began to see how it is that this facility was using sticks, stones, rocks, little plastic beads, the making of fire, as a part of their directed, facilitated therapeutic process. And these young people were healing. They were healing through the loss of their parents. They were healing through abuse. They were healing through a tremendous amount of grief and through the use of rocks, right? Through the use of things that had subjective associations attributed to them, where the objects, that leaf, that twig, that stone, had evocative characteristics, and where they were engaging with it in a dynamic way. And all of a sudden, over the course of weeks and months, they were healing through these profound traumas. And it was a real game changer for me. And after this initial field research, I was able to construct the mechanics of the theory and really nail down the component parts as I shared them with you. But of course, the real matter for me was museums, because museums matter. And I set about identifying and collecting a group of museums with whom I could conduct case studies, collect data, and do some empirical research, and begin to see if I might be able to find evidence of this dynamic playing out in museum environments. And as you'll see in my examples, I worked with some museums that are very conventional. They're very passive. You're not touching anything. They have a very conventional and traditional modality of display and exhibitry. And then I also worked with some museums that are highly participatory and innovative in terms of how audiences are engaging within the environments. And I did that in addition as well. I identified museums that were also dealing with a wide range of subjects that I knew would lend themselves to finding the kind of data that I needed. So you'll see that some of the museums, the subject of the institutions, have to do with trauma and atrocity. And then other institutions do not really at all. And yet I saw everything playing out at every single one of these institutions, which you'll see. The critical thing to know about doing this research, though, was that I knew straight away how activating it is to talk about objects. All you do is you can just ask anybody at any point, at any time, tell me about this object. And the next thing you know, you could be going down a wormhole very easily, because people, without even realizing it, if they get to talking about something that's very meaningful, all of a sudden a whole lot comes out, right? And people can become very activated very easily. And so I knew that I needed to construct a research methodology that was going to be very heuristic, that would follow an appropriate process, but also be very natural, very heuristic. And it also needed to be safe. It needed to be ethical. I needed to make sure that the participants who were being interviewed were going to be safe, psychologically safe. So my two research associates, Ross Laird and Jason McCowan, joined me as a part of the data collection so that they could kind of get cues on whether or not people are kind of going sideways, so that we could dig very deeply and talk very deeply and intimately about object relationships, and make sure that we were not going to frankly traumatize or re-traumatize people, which it turns out can happen very easily. So had my team, had my theory, had a good research process, and I began at what, it seemed like just so obvious to me, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. Here I had an institution that practically overnight had hundreds of thousands of objects that were desperately being donated by survivors, by first responders, and mostly by relatives of victims of the atrocity. And this institution very, quickly in museum terms, meaning just the first handful of years, had to set up a very careful protocol of how to receive objects from people, and how to do so in a way that was very methodical, but very thoughtful and very reverent. And right there, if you're getting this, we have the giving and receiving dynamic playing out writ large. But I went to the institution and conducted, it was just about a dozen interviews with people who had donated objects. And these participants were saying some of the most remarkable things. And first of all, being able to interview people who lost a child, who lost their husband, who lost their wife because of this one day in this one moment in this one place is, as a researcher, it's a real trick. Which is why I highly recommend anybody who is going into an area of research, and certainly any kind of data collection of this sort. And again, especially if it's a very open-ended heuristic process, please, please, please be safe. And I always do indeed recommend working with professional therapists if you are going to be working with highly activating content, which a lot of folks in the museum world do really on a regular basis. But the responses that I got from the interviews, the data, first of all, gave evidence to like all 7 of these dynamic actions. But people were so clearly articulating these dynamic actions. I gave my husband's crushed wristwatch to this museum because I needed to be released from it. I needed to say goodbye. I needed to move on. And this museum gave me the ability to reach closure. Okay, right then and there, wow, talk about purposefulness, right? Talk about intentionality, really ultimate goals for any kind of museum or institution of its sort. People were concerned because they were showing up with like a baggie in their purse, right? With, a little stick in it, right? Or part of a wallet. And they were being received by the museum with so much reverence and intentionality and care that the process of giving and receiving was played out over and over and over again to a truly therapeutic effect. And on people, because so many people who are donating are local, they will go to the museum again and again to visit their object. And so many people talked about, I just need to know it's there. I don't even need to see it. I just need to know it is there. And that it is being kept safe. And people felt this synergizing experience because their object was being donated along with all of these other objects that all together constructed the meaning of this moment in time and the meaning that it held for themselves, but also a construction of the meaning of the event for the whole world. All of those things were really hitting at the ability for people to develop endurance and resilience, to be able to form as a part of their trauma healing that personal power that is so essential to our well-being and to our state of normative health, and so on. People talked about my identity is braided within this institution. Really remarkable things from this first study. The next thing, again, I wanted to begin with institutions that I was certain I would be able to encounter trauma. Working with trauma-related subjects in my thinking as a researcher would give me a better chance of being able to see the healing aspects, those therapeutic outcomes within the object relationships. So off I went with, and Melissa is here, Delbegovich, my former student and my research associate, beloved. We, and also a Bosnian war survivor. We went to Bosnia. And there we were at the absolutely remarkable War Childhood Museum. And this is an institution that is comprised of objects that had been donated by adults who were children at the time of the Bosnian war years. And so these are objects basically that people had been holding on to for about 20 years. And one of the most remarkable men I think I've ever met, Yasmin Gohelovich, created the War Childhood Museum. He himself, a war childhood survivor, created this institution to become a repository and a place to tell the story, not just of the Bosnian War, but of being a child of war. And you go there and everything is an object. And from somebody who was a child during the war, every object has a profound story. And furthermore, the labels are all written only from the people who were children during the wartime, the period of the war. And it is absolutely breathtaking. And I had the pleasure with Melissa of interviewing, I think it was, I don't know what we did. What did we do, Melissa? 16 people, 15, something like that. And we got the same thing. We heard time and again about the idea of giving and being received, people talking about, I didn't think my object was special, and it was received with such reverence. And now I see it on display, and I can't believe the relief, the unburdening. I feel like I can move on with my life, but I also feel powerful. I feel like my story is combined with other people's story. I am a synergized part of this institution. A favorite quote that I have from all of my years working with this came from this study, where a woman said, my object is a scream, and this scream combined with all of the other screams, all of the other objects, scream together to tell the world never to do this to children again. So this woman who had donated, I don't know if it was a bicycle, I think, or something along those lines, literally knew that her act of donating this object not only was a part of her own health and healing, but was actually going to change the world. The experience that she had of donating to a larger purpose or synergizing through this object dynamic was mind-blowing. That was a huge part of the study in Bosnia. Then it was time to look a little bit more at well-being and more in more of like a normative range of mental health experience. And off I went to Derby, England, which is right in the middle of England, where there is this remarkable Darby Museum and Art Gallery, which as a part of its mission is dedicated specifically to maintaining health and well-being in all of its constituencies, the people who work there, the local community, all of its audiences, and really in the broader world. They're a part of a worldwide initiative in museums working towards health and well-being in their constituencies. I went to Derby for that reason, because I thought, well, let's see, how that looks, how that mission looks in practice. But furthermore, I went there because you're in the middle of England, in this particular city of Derby, which is actually one of the first real industrial centers in England. This is home to a very, very broad socioeconomic demographic. It is also incredibly culturally diverse. And it is also the area in England where there is a tremendous amount of refugees coming in. And so I went there knowing that I was going to be able to interview a wide variety of people. And furthermore, this museum is remarkable because it is co-curated and co-created by the community. So think of it as a mini Met. They have this incredible collection of rarefied objects, cultural objects, things from around the world, across time. And their main galleries featuring world culture, objects related to world culture, are curated by the general public. And even the general public was involved in restorative practice with a number of objects, and on and on and on. So the level of participation, we're now looking at an institution where people are they're up to their elbows in the creation of the museum. And it's another truly groundbreaking institution. And I interviewed, I think I did 35 when I was there. And so I was staff, volunteers, visitors. People were contributing personal objects at the time as well to the institution. And there we were, giving and being received. Things are safe and associative. People, because they were able to touch a lot of objects, the touching dynamic, and people going to the museum over and over again because of the sense of calm, the restorative peace, was profound. And that's that hypnoglyph haptic response. There was a lot of release and unburdening from grief, because lo and behold, you're in an institution that's very upbeat and very happy, and all about health and well-being, and you're looking at these beautiful and incredible objects. And when you interview people and they're like, yeah, this is a box of buttons that I had from my childhood, minutes later they're in tears. And it's because many of these object relationships that we have in our lives are affiliated with loss or grief, and things that are really a part of an ongoing process. So when you, yet again, going back to the safe and ethical research practices, it is so critical to never assume that things are going to, be easy or upbeat or lack complexity, because a lot of times people will catch themselves kind of falling to bits, talking about what seemed to have been a simple object that brought them joy, but that also, as it turns out, when they really share, they realize is very intertwined with a person or a place, a moment that is very difficult for them. So we saw a lot of release and unburdening by people who were able to share and donate objects to this museum. Synergy, making, it was all there. And then it was time to come back to New York and the wonderful museum at FIT. And part of why I definitely wanted to work at FIT outside of my sisterly love for my home institution was the fact that the museum was having this absolutely remarkable exhibition called Fashion Unraveled. And so they had items on display that were in the process of being made. They had beautiful pieces of clothing that had been altered or changed by their owners, reworked, resewn, and they also had items of clothing that showed signs of wear. And I was like, there's something in there. And I had been hearing so much about clothing from all of the other studies. And I thought, okay, we're going to find something great. And also you can see in the photograph on the left, they also had a digital kiosk where people could submit photographs of an item of clothing and a little bit about the story related to it. So there was that simple element of audience participation. And sure enough, giving and being received. The composition of objects was a big one that came out from this study. People were responding to the juxtaposition of objects and talking about them in incredibly meaningful, resonant ways. People, and here's the super amazing thing, you can't touch anything, right? You can't manipulate anything. People described looking at a piece of clothing and, signs of its wear, being threadbare, let's say. And they talked about the object as if they were touching it. They were talking about what it feels like on their fingers, or they talk about what it feels like to weave when they were looking at another item in the collection that was in the process of being made. So I was able to really dig even deeper into that therapeutic object dynamic of making, because it works even just by seeing signs of making. And one other quick example on that, I then went back to the data from the Darby Museum and Art Gallery and dig this. There's a little Sirian oil lamp that was made by a child in the collection. Ancient, precious little thing, and it's got the thumbprint in the clay of the little child that was crafting it. How many people, when I interviewed them, talked about that oil lamp? And they talked about it as if they were holding it. They talked about it as if they could feel that little child's thumbprint. It was amazing. And they talked about the making of the object. They didn't make this object, and it's ancient. It has nothing to do with them. And everybody, when they started talking about that object on display, talked about it in such numinous and evocative ways, and about its making. So at any rate, that was a remarkable example. As the book was being released at the tag end of 2019, I was underway with a Fulbright study, because if you are a researcher, it never really ends. And if you are a scholar present here now today and you have figured out how to stop doing research, please tell me, because I haven't figured it out yet, because I did a Fulbright at this remarkable museum in Sweden, the Museum of Mediterranean and Near Eastern Antiquities. And this was a game changer for me. I knew that the theory, I was really confident that the theory played out in any number of museum environments, but I had really gotten hooked on refugees. And I was beginning to really question, what kind of impact can museums make on people who are in states of humanitarian crisis? And how does the object dynamic work when you are dealing with a very heightened state of trauma, and not just individual trauma, but mass trauma? So this museum created an exhibition called Stories from Syria. And it was a collection, as you can see in some of the images, of ordinary everyday objects that Syrian refugees managed to bring with them as they were escaping, as they were fleeing their homes. And everything here was mind-boggling. I went the minute I heard about it in these little child's sneakers that are scuffed and scarred, and they're little Spider-Man sneakers. And this kid wore these sneakers as he was dumped out of his raft and had to swim to shore in the middle of night to get to Sweden. I mean, these stories are breathtaking and heart-wrenching. And when you look at all of the Barbie dolls or the little scarf, the earrings that had been stowed away in a child's diaper to be able to get brought into Sweden safely. When you hear the stories of these objects, it's unbelievable. So I had to go and I had to get a Fulbright, and there I went and I spent a few weeks in Sweden traveling all around the country and meeting with the most miraculous, amazing, powerful people I've met, who incredibly generously talked about their object relationships. And they talked about the dynamic action of working with the museum to co-create this exhibition, Stories from Syria. And the evidence of the psychotherapeutic object dynamics was, I mean, it was everywhere. It was everywhere. All of those dynamic actions were at play. And furthermore, what I was able to do was begin to really get a handhold on the meaningfulness through the conduit of these object experiences, the level of meaningfulness and purposefulness a museum can have to people. And this is the short list. Outcomes of this study: vulnerability and trust. As a result of this exhibition, the refugees were talking about how they were able to trust not just the museum with the most, think about it, it's like the one thing they could save as they were fleeing their home. And they were loaning it to the museum for an entire year. The vulnerability and the trust in that action is profound. They talked about trusting the museum and also the Swedish people. They talked about how putting it on display proved that what had happened to them was actually real, because a lot of times trauma makes things not real. So they were dealing with that trauma healing outcome I was talking about earlier. Syrians, as a part of their culture, have an enormous ethic of giving, and they were finally able to give instead of just receive. Right, the support from Sweden. They were able to give their objects, their story, and give through vulnerability and give their trust. Okay, it was huge. A lot of pride, a lot of loss was related to these objects, a lot of gratitude. And the big one, which I don't have time to get into, but would love to share if anybody is interested, is this museum became a house. These are people whose houses were blown up. Right? They lost their house. They had to leave everything. And by the way, and they kept their house keys. Many of these folks kept their house keys. They don't have a house, but they got the keys because they couldn't bear, right, to give up their house keys. The museum made a new house for them. And that's what this exhibition was. And I can't tell you how many times when I'm interviewing people, they would just weep. And they're like, I have a house in Sweden. And they did not mean the temporary housing that they were in. They were talking about the museum. What an incredible thing. So the book is out, and I really hope that it's an object that is received with love. I know that time is running a little bit short. Told you, Greta, I can't help it. I'm going to do a quick reading. Is that okay? Just a couple of minutes? I'm just going to read a much smaller portion. I'm going to read an intro from Ordinary Importance. There are all of these interviews I'm talking about are all in the book, and they're really amazing.
Brenda, right before you start reading, I just wanted to encourage people to go ahead and type in any questions while Brenda is reading.
Yes, please do. And I'm going to read a tiny bit, not the whole thing I was going to do. But just so you can get a quick taste. There's a moment, and you can practically count on it, when the person telling you about an important object in their lives is suddenly struck by the weight of its meaning. They entered into the conversation knowing it was important to them in some way or another. They could associate it with meaningful people, places, or events in their lives. They kept it, they cared for it, or they gifted it, or they destroyed it. The objects equaled intent. Nevertheless, in those moments, you find yourself sitting with these people at work, a cafe, on the train, and as you listen to them talk about their objects and what their objects mean, And why they do with it, whatever it is that they do with it, you can see the point at which they realize their story is actually not quite so silly or ordinary or superficial as they had thought or had hoped. There's usually a pause. The person's eyes might look down at the table, or they might cock their head slightly. Their voice will become softer, and suddenly they recognize a purpose or a preciousness that they had not been aware of before. And in turn, perhaps they recognize too in themselves something purposeful and precious that they had not seen before. I'm going to actually stop it there because I'm so concerned about time and everybody's being so generous. But there's an awful lot more of that kind of thing with a whole bunch of the science in here, but most importantly, the words of all of those people I interviewed. But what an act of love, and what an honor, what a totally self-indulgent pleasure it is to talk about this with everybody. So thank you. And thank you, Greta.
Well, thank you, Brenda. And as always, it's awe-inspiring and just a deep sense of thoughtfulness that comes across with everything that you say. Perhaps since we don't have much time, it's sort of okay that it seems like our chat isn't
actually we do have a question. We do have a question. It's, have you ever been to the Museum of Innocence by Orphan Pamuk? If not, I think it would be most interesting for you.
So the Museum of Innocence is absolutely amazing, and I have not been able to go. And Turkey at various times has been a little tricky to get to, and especially right now, unfortunately, it's high on the list, and there are pieces from the work of Orhan Pamuk that are in my research, unquestionably, and it's definitely. And I got to meet Mr. Pamuk as well. If you don't know him, he's a Nobel laureate in literature, and absolutely mind-boggling. And he talks about all this kind of stuff that I talk about. Museums are amazing. Thank you for that.
Brenda, I wanted to ask you a question about this time when we've been on this long pause, and there's sort of this like idea everybody or a lot of people are cleaning out their closets and going through things and giving away things. And it's like, is that I guess that would be part of the giving and receiving, but I wonder what you make of that, or if you're going to focus in on that at any time, like what that process is for this past year. You made reference a little bit in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be the anticipation anyways that there's going to be a whole lot of fascinating dynamics in play. And I didn't even get into repatriation. I did a conference presentation about the ethics and the potentials of what happens when you repatriate objects from museums. And how this could be involved as well. But there's going to be a whole lot of release and unburdening as a result. There already is a lot of people just trying to clear house, literally and psychologically. We are going to see, I anticipate, a desperate need for touch. Wherever possible, in every way, definitely with objects. Those are two big ones. And the giving and receiving, needing to reconnect with people, with self, also another one that I know we're going to see. And the museum, I'm working with many museums right now with this work and preparing for post-COVID world. And a lot of these dynamics are anticipated and being planned for.
Great. Alexander, I think you can unmute yourself now we've empowered that.
Thank you so very much, Brenda. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. Also, I'm looking forward to read the book. So one question, because I have not read your conclusions, I don't know if there's a concluding chapter also in the book, Brenda, about recommendations now that you took away from all of these case studies that you had as an advice for the next generation also, I mean, whom we are teaching, Brenda.
There's a whole big old conclusion. Thank you so much. In addition to all of the outcomes, there are two main things. There's a chapter, a brilliant chapter written by the therapists, my collaborators, about if you're going to do work of this type, what the ethical considerations are, and the ability to keep people safe, but also considerations for creating museum environments, and this for students especially. How it is that as an artist, as a designer, as a creator of exhibitions and of experiences that have objects for people, what is it that you really need to know when you are inviting sharing or engagement, anything at all related to this? Because our places are so much more powerful than people realize. We're driving a Ferrari. It's not a little putt-putt. It's not your mom's station wagon. Our museums are incredible vehicles, and they're very powerful. And just because you don't see it on people's faces a lot, the book concludes with a lot of things that you need to know, things that you need to consider, how to go about doing this kind of work, but also how do you design towards health and healing outcomes? How do you create environments towards health and healing outcomes? How to use objects with intention? So there's all of that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Just maybe because I want to add, I did curate an exhibition about 5 years ago or so in the Smithsonian about one specific object that was found in Babylon in Iraq, and now it's making the rounds as this object that has the first human declaration. It's called the Cyrus Cylinder. And I remember visitors who cried in front of the objects of Brenda. So I can really also just stress what you said, that these emotions also that objects cause. I was surprised when I saw really these tears by someone seeing this object and these stories that are related to it. So it really touches people. Thank you.
Isn't it amazing? That's a numinous, that's a majorly numinous object. Let's do a study just about that. We could, why not? Wouldn't that be exciting? Ooh, tomorrow.
So I have a couple questions from my colleague, Michael Matthews. He asks, one, how do hoarders fit into your object studies? And two, what can one do when a museum doesn't accept an object?
Oh boy. Number one, I very intentionally steered clear of hoarders because that's a pathology that is well outside of what I was seeking to work with and identify. I was working within a normative state range of psychological experience, even though I was including trauma. Still is everyday experience. Hoarding is a deep pathology. So I steered clear of that. Boy, do I get that question a lot. And that's a big area. Definitely not one of my expertise. And then, oh, for God's sake, what was the second part of that question? Long day.
Yeah. What do you do if a museum doesn't accept an object, which I know I've heard that frequently about places.
I had repressed the second part of that question because it's so difficult. If you are a museum that has a mission, okay, that has an intention to receive objects from whomever, you have to receive them. You have no choice. You might, if you have that as a dedicated part of a strategic plan of your missions, whatever it is, if you have a program and a protocol for receiving objects, the amount of trauma, believe it or not, that you can take. I mean, and just imagine there's somebody you love and you're giving them a gift and and so much is wrapped up in this gift and they say no. Or you see them just kind of take it and they toss it and they're like, yeah, all right, let's go get a drink. And you're just in, right? It's a crazy thing. And that is why the museums show, and this is also, by the way, Alex, it's in the book as well, how to receive objects and when does a museum choose to receive objects. Even if it's a museum at FIT, we will receive your digital photographs of objects. and display those in a kiosk and online. Doing so is essential, because otherwise you're saying no. The sheer act of receiving an object is an act of saying yes, and it connects with belonging, community, self in relationship to family and others. It is an enormous part of our primary identity construct. So somebody receiving or refusing a meaningful gift or object actually can damage a person on a prime. I'm not going to say you're going to fall to bits, but you might, depending on what it is.
Yeah, you may have thought of this already, but actually in the library world, we have that as well. That sometimes it's very important for somebody to give a whole collection of books because that's representative of this whole world of knowledge for that person. So lots of lovely congratulations in the chats. If Brenda is willing, we're a little bit over time, but if anybody wants to either type anything else or simply unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to do so.
Can I ask something?
Yes, Paul.
Hi, do you ever have any experience of people like having almost like a visual revelation in front of an object?
Oh, yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And Alex gave a nice example of it. Another favorite example, Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat. Famously was on display in a traveling exhibition many, many, many years ago, and people would stop. They couldn't touch it. They weren't Abraham Lincoln. They weren't related to Abraham Lincoln. They had only known about Abraham Lincoln through, history and so forth. And people would openly weep in front of this hat. And in a way, that was one of the things that when I would teach that for years and years in my object studies and phenomenological study work in my program, I was like, I couldn't explain why. I could say it was happening. I could say clearly it was an important object, it was powerful, but I couldn't explain, but why? How is it that a person can be so moved by, by Alex's object and by, a hat? What's going on there? And it is, if you look into the area of phenomenological object study, there is a quality called the numinous, which is a very powerful, evocative characteristic of an object. And it is as if the object literally speaks to you, even if you don't know what it is. And it has to do with whatever your personal association is. Who knows? That's subjective. Okay. Whatever it is that it's triggering or activating in you, that's a personal thing. But then it also, the quality of display. Is the museum making it accessible visually? Is it a quiet space, right? All of these different elements create a condition for deep engagement and for somebody to associate with that object. And the act of seeing is a dynamic action. If you can't see, the act of touching can be that dynamic. It can be quite passive indeed, but that it happens all the time, and it happens in ways that dumbfound people.
Do you think that an object can make somebody have a visual experience, like see something, like a...
So that gets into the world of the transpersonal, and that's another sort of extension of the numinous experience. And people can literally, and it's heightened, and it's not, very common from what I can tell, but the therapists talk about this quite a lot. And it's literally, you feel like you've literally kind of left your body sometimes. It's a very particular thing, in a very heightened state. Of the numinous experience, and it's in the world of the transpersonal study.
Thank you.
I was just going to say on a lighter way, Antiques Roadshow.
Yay!
You see how people bring their things and how long they've had them.
I love it. I'm such a junkie with full. I don't care. I watch American Pickers. Holy cow. I mean, I will just look at junk and just be so amazed. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the funny thing is that people often ask, well, oh, you must have so many incredibly meaningful objects. And honestly, it's like, I don't know, if the house was on fire and I had to grab one thing and run, I could really live without, you know, most everything that I own. It's really, I'm so interested in objects, but I really don't have, by the way, things of my own that are quite that meaningful, like to that extent. I
Well,
love
sometimes it's even it's very peaceful not to be around your own objects that mean a lot, right? If you like to stay in a hotel room or go stay at a friend's house, it's like a whole different kind of
it's about I'm a junkie, really. It's a total, really. Don't invite me to your home because I'm just going to want to ask you. I'm just going to want to tell me about this. It really is addictive.
Everything is a prompt for an interview. All right, well, we do have other questions, but I think I'm going to close up. But just to leave you with some questions, one of the questions was, have you interviewed somebody that is blind? I'm always also sort of curious if you've interviewed people like in solitary confinement or somewhere where there's a real absence of objects, but I'm not going to let you answer them.
It's funny you should mention.
Instead,
upcoming.
for those people who are left, I would like to say that for more information on FIT authors or how to submit to be featured, you can go to our website, authors.fitnyc.edu. And I really just want to thank you, Brenda, yet again for a wonderful presentation. And I'm sure that some of you may still have questions for Brenda, and you know where to find her. And I'm sure she would be happy to hear from you. And so I hope everyone has a lovely evening and has a peaceful time thinking about their object of their choice tonight.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Is your book available on?
Oh, what a good question.
Oh yeah, that's I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, it's, you know, Routledge, you'll get it at Routledge, Taylor and Francis. And actually the hardcover is ungodly expensive. It's a monograph. So it's one of these, apparently scholars are all very wealthy. So if you wait, I think a few more months, it's going to be in paperback soon. So wait for the paperback. And you can also get it as an ebook, but you'll find it in the monograph series of Routledge, Taylor and Francis.
Yeah, in the old days, I would encourage you to come to the library, but of course you could request it and pick it up on curbside pickup. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for attending tonight. It was great to see so many of you, and until next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Greta.